Hello and welcome to this UNESCO Masterclass Series session on disaster risk reduction and ecosystem services. I'm Antoine Nayot from the University of the South Pacific, Pacific Center for Environment and Sustainable Development, and today we look at an overview of ecosystem services and their role in human well-being. Our learning outcomes for this lecture are 1. To explain what we mean by an ecosystem service. 2. Define the different types of ecosystem services in the Pacific region. 3. Evaluate the importance of ecosystem services. And 4. Gain an understanding of the role ecosystem services play in climate change adaptation. Ecosystem services can be defined as the benefits people obtain from ecosystems and can be classified into 4 types. 1. Supporting. 2. Provisioning. 3. Cultural. And 4. Regulating. The graphic on the left lists some of the main ecosystem services in each type. For instance, a single ecosystem such as a mangrove area can provide supporting services through photosynthesis and biodiversity, provisioning services by providing food and fisheries resources, regulating services by storing carbon, and cultural services through recreation and tourism. Here on this slide you can see 4 examples of the types of ecosystem services found in the Pacific region. Mangrove roots trap fine sediments from land runoffs, protecting coastal reefs, and also serve as recreational areas in cohabitation with humans. Pristine mountain springs supply fresh water for island communities on high islands, while photosynthetic marine algae and phytoplankton provide the bulk of primary production on the planet, serving as the basis of the oceanic food chain. Let us now watch a snippet of the video Introduction to Marine Ecosystem Services by the University of Queensland.
Hi there, my name is Peter Mumby. I'm a coral reef ecologist at the University of Queensland. And today we're going to be talking about marine ecosystem services. And these are the services that natural ecosystems provide to humans for free. We're going to take a look now at a variety of different types of ecosystem service. We're going to start with provisioning services, and a very obvious one is the ability of mangroves to provide wood, and that wood might be used as a source of fuel, or it might be used for building houses, for example. If we move on to coral reefs, we're familiar with the numbers of fish that you find on a reef, and of course this provides a provisioning service of food in terms of reef fish and a source of protein. Another very important provisioning service is pharmaceutical products. And many tropical organisms have a huge number of bacteria associated with them, particularly some of the invertebrates and algae. And as an example, there's actually a Caribbean sea squirt that's had a very strong reaction against some cancer agents. And in fact, chemicals that were then developed as drugs from these sea squirts have been synthesized and are now used in the treatment of ovarian cancer. Another category of service are regulating services, and these are services that essentially regulate the environment that we experience, and of course providing us some benefit. Now, looking at an example of a coral reef, we know that when you have large waves coming into the coast, maybe because there's a storm out in the ocean, that when those waves break upon the reef, much of that wave energy is dissipated by the reef itself. And the wave passing over the reef reduces in size and strength. Now, that wave can then carry on moving into the lagoon, and as it does so, it might encounter mangroves. Mangroves and the mud that sits underneath them also serve as a regulating service, in that they further attenuate the amount of energy that's being brought into the coast by this wave. Moving gears now to cultural services. One of my personal favourite services is the enjoyment you get from diving on a coral reef. And so that would be a service of tourism for a lot of people. Another cultural service might be kayaking through a mangrove. It's a fantastic way that sort of connect with nature. There's lots of birds, there'll be turtles in there, maybe even lucky and see a crocodile. But this is often a very important way in which people can keep their connection with nature fresh. And then lastly, there's more intangible cultural benefits, often what's known as a sense of place. And these are the sorts of benefits you accrue by having some kind of familiarity and sense of identity and sort of linkage with a healthy ecosystem. You know, that might be for some people seeing birds at the bottom of their garden. It might be people in a tropical seascape looking out from a sandy beach and seeing healthy turtles swimming by, lots of diverse reef fish swimming across a healthy reef. Those are the sorts of things that people benefit from, and sometimes they take them for granted. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment went through a fairly extensive categorization of ecosystem services. So if we look at how these map on to the three major habitats in tropical ecosystems, which are coral reefs, seagrasses and mangroves, what we see again are the major services, which are provisioning services, which are food, such as fish, wood and fibre, which come from mangroves, regulating services, such as storm protection, and then finally these cultural services. Now the important thing is that these services actually deliver benefits to humans, and they benefit our well-being overall. And so let's look at some examples. For example, the link between sort of food and fish and wood and fibre benefits us in a number of ways. By providing wood, you're able to build houses, which is an essential thing as a basic material for a good life. Health is important. We know that eating fish is very important for our health. It provides omega-3 and other sorts of essential minerals and nutrients. Security. Having a prolific supply of wood can actually provide some kind of energy security in certain sorts of environments. If we look at storm protection, we can think of a whole variety of benefits. Again, by shadowing areas of the coast from incident wave energy, we're providing good, secure housing. So we're getting benefit there for security and a well-being and a place to live, as well as potential benefits to health, because if you prevent the amount of flooding that can occur after major storms, then it's less likely that sewers will overflow, and there'll be all sorts of health problems that can follow on from that. And then if we look at the cultural services, well, these are good for sort of maintaining good social relations and often good for our mental well-being. Being able to connect with green spaces is often very good for our overall quality of life. Sometimes ask, why should we value ecosystem services? And there's many reasons for doing this, but one of them is that it helps hopefully prevent us making inappropriate environmental decisions. And I can give you an example from Cancun in Mexico. Now, Cancun is extremely important. It's a beautiful place to visit on the northern tip of the Yucatan coast in the Caribbean. So it's a real tourism mecca. However, this is a satellite image of the area around Cancun in 2005, shortly after it had been hit by a hurricane. And what this hurricane did is it removed vast amounts of sand from the beaches. One of the reasons for that is because most of the mangrove that might have been protecting that coastal fringe had been removed to make way for the resorts, and also the coral reefs a little way offshore aren't in the best of health. Now, if we look a bit further into the future, this is a more recent satellite image, you can see that the beaches around the coast are once again restored and looking beautiful. However, this cost $90 million. This was a very expensive human intervention to replace something that nature usually provides to us virtually for free. So if we look at what's actually happened here, we have a mangrove removal for hotel development. That's the start. This then leads to a change in the ability of a coastal area to provide natural protection from storms. Once that happens, we see a removal of sand and sediment and the need for humans to replace that themselves. So they go out onto the coast and they dredge the seabed for new sand that they can then dump back onto the coast to make the beaches once more. Unfortunately, the process of all that dredging can have damaging impacts all of its own. It leads to a lot of sediment entering into the water that can smother coral reefs and essentially cause coral mortality. If you kill the coral, then this then reduces the natural ability of the ecosystem to act as a coastal defense, maybe increasing the amount of erosion that happens on the coastal zone. So this becomes a kind of reinforcing cycle that's not to human advantage. So let's just summarize why we need to value ecosystem services. Well, first of all, it's really important that countries try and incorporate their natural capital in their national sets of accounts. almost all countries keep account of their mineral wealth, of their oil and gas reserves, of their human capital, but very rarely do they actually value the ecosystem services that are often taken for granted, things like the provision of clean drinking water when it's filtered through appropriate vegetation. And so by failing to do this, there's a real risk that we may not adequately monitor and take corrective action should there be a problem, should we start losing some of those ecosystem services. Now, another reason for doing it is to help the community understand how they benefit from ecosystems. Because as I said, I think often people just take things for granted, and having greater communication and valuation will help change people's perspective and perhaps lead to more environmentally friendly behaviour. And then another aspect that should follow on from this is by more appropriately valuing our environment, it's more likely that we'll put the resources needed to maintain a good environment and make those available for use to try and keep this environment healthy for everybody's benefit. Now, if we want to break down the process of valuing services, then it's essentially a three-step process. And let's illustrate that with a coral reef example. We start with the state of an ecosystem, and the state might just be the amount of living coral, the complexity of that reef. We know that corals have these sort of very complex structures that provide lots of hiding places to support high levels of biodiversity. So you might measure its state by just going into the field, measuring how much coral is there, and so forth. That state supports a function, and it's that ecosystem function that we're often interested in. In this case, a function might be the provision of habitat to support lots of reef fish. So it's the ability of a reef to provide habitat, to have lots of fish available and surviving and undertaking predator-prey interactions as we talked about. And it's then that group of fish that provides a service, because people then can come along and fish those and generate food and a livelihood. So it's state, function, service. Of course, what we're concerned about is that if you don't have such a good state, maybe in this case we have a reef that's been dynamited, that might provide much less habitat quality, and therefore there'll be fewer fish living on that reef. And if there's fewer fish, the benefits to people are going to be lower. And to some extent, these things can be reinforcing. So if we do have a system of a healthy reef with prolific function that allows us to generate a good livelihood from that, if some of that resource is being reinvested into the protection and maintenance of that habitat because we're valuing what it's providing for us, then it's more likely that we'll have this feedback of a high value allowing us to maintain that system in a good state by preventing some of the stressors such as sediment runoff, overfishing, and damaging fishing techniques from occurring. If, on the other hand, we don't even try to value that service, then it's more likely that people will take poorer decisions, which will lead to a degradation of that reef state, which we know ends up with us essentially having lower benefits at the end of the day. So it should be a sort of virtuous cycle where valuing something that's really important to us helps us maintain it. Okay. So far what we've really talked about then is the sort of ecological component, and that's where biologists and ecologists often worked to forge this link between the state of a system and its function. And that includes a lot of ecology. It certainly includes things like predator-prey interactions that we've already talked about. And then the linking it to the services is how people benefit from that, and that's the preserve of social scientists and economists.
This pictorial from the 2001 Millennium Ecosystem Assessment shows the linkages between ecosystem services and human well-being. The 4 types of ecosystem services support, provide for, regulate, and offer cultural benefit to the 5 constituents of human well-being, which are security, basic materials for a good life, health, good social relations, and freedom of choice and action. Very often, ecosystem services are considered free, but they have in fact an economic value that is not necessarily financial. By preserving such services, we save on the avoidant cost of replacing these resources. Human activities create stress on our planet's biosphere where life resides. According to the Stockholm Resiliency Center, the 9 planetary boundaries are climate change, stratospheric ozone, ocean acidification, nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, biodiversity loss, land use change, and freshwater use. 3 have already been breached: climate change, nitrogen cycle, and biodiversity loss. There may still be time to mitigate ocean acidification and damaged ecosystem services, land and water use, if we act now to drastically reduce CO2 emissions. This slide from the journal Science shows changes in ocean physics and chemistry and impacts on organisms and ecosystem services according to stringent RCP 2.6 and high business as usual RCP 8.5 CO2 emission scenarios. Changes in temperature, pH, in 2090 to 2099 are relative to pre-industrial 1870 to 1899. Sea level rise in 2100 is relative to 1901. Purple indicates very high risk of impact. This recent important study by Gattuso et al. In the journal Science reinforced the notion that oceans provide essential ecosystem services for humankind, that the effects of our carbon dioxide emissions are already detectable and are highly likely to cause massive mortality on many marine and coastal organisms before the end of this century, and that these global impacts can only be reversed to an immediate and substantial reduction in our CO2 emissions. Failing to do this will ultimately lead to the demise of oceanic ecosystem services as we know them today, with profound effects for the survival of our human species. Past response to the management of natural resources considered them as distinct and isolated units. Modern ways to resource management recognize the linkage between all plants, animals, and humans to the physical environment, forming a holistic ecosystem unit. This is called ecosystem-based management or governance, a more appropriate term than ecosystem-based adaptation. Simply put, the ridge-to-reef approach is a holistic appreciation of an island ecosystem where all biomes and their interactions are considered. For instance, something happening uphill, the ridge, will eventually affect something downstream, the reef. A typical example is deforestation for agriculture in the hills that input sediment loads into rivers that eventually make it to the lagoon and choke corals and other organisms, thereby reducing reef productivity. A healthy rainforest and watershed is equivalent to an healthy lagoon and reef ecosystem. A healthy rainforest and watershed is equivalent to a healthy lagoon and reef system. Here are some additional videos for you to watch on ecosystems and their role. We have now reached the end of our lecture. Thank you very much for staying with us, and we wish you enjoyable studies.